Hi everybody, thanks for joining us for our next session of Ask the Expert. I'm very delighted to be here, both myself and Will. Introduce you to Will. Will's our Principal Technical Consultant looking after the Victorian region. Hi Will.
Hi Joel, how you doing?
Excellent. We're both very passionate about performance and excited to be bringing this talk to you today. We've had a lot of questions and we've had a lot of interest in this, so we're really excited to get moving. So the session objectives today are really to cover off a number of the elements that we saw from the questions that came through, and we've sort of categorized them into three main topic areas, and then we'll try and have a little bit of audience Q&A at the end for anything that falls outside these areas. So the first one is around justifying the investment of performance testing. The second one is how and when should you consider it. The third one is around any trending practices that we're seeing and what the impact of that may be on the performance testing industry. So how do you justify the investment in performance testing? Well, what we found is that change is driven by pain, and this is never seen more so than in some of our recent events, because when IT goes bad, it tends to go horribly bad. Remember Click Frenzy tried to disrupt the online sales, and we know what happened there. We had a major Australian retailer tried to disrupt the Boxing Day sales of 2014 and launch on Christmas Eve, and they were down for 7 days for an issue that they told the world couldn't be found in testing. I know nobody on this session would believe that. The My School website famously went down at 1 a.m. I'm not sure anyone would believe that there'd be that many parents sitting up waiting till 1 a.m. to check the school results. I know I certainly wouldn't be. And at the start of this month, we actually had Michigan State University had their online store crash at 1 a.m. as well when they started selling their own Nike branded gear. Ironically, 1 a.m. maybe there's a batch job running. So what we realize is that if change is driven by pain, what is the pain that's relevant to your organization or project? Is it loss of customers? We've noticed in recent statistics that in 2013 we saw 37% of customers were abandoning a mobile site or application if it fails to load in 3 seconds. I thought that was pretty high in 2013. The latest stats from 2016 from Google bring that up to 53%. This is astonishing. This is over half of your visitors, if the app won't load in 3 seconds, will leave. So if loss of customers are a driver for your business, this is a way that you can help justify performance testing. It's a way that, it's all about identifying that pain point. The fact that we're also combining this with our increase in application size, we've noticed that web pages are increasing in size year on year on year. Something's going to break here. So we're starting to see some vendors do really well in the application space in terms of performance, and they're gaining customers and gaining traction, and we're seeing others who are really starting to lag behind as we become less and less patient. Is missing income, is this the driver? Is this the pain point for your business that you can use to justify performance testing? We all remember brands like Yahoo, AltaVista, Lycos. These are all search engines. We used to use them every day. But what happened? Google came into the market and disrupted them with speed, and the rest is history. Amazon and Walmart have found that as much as $1 million in revenue they're seeing an increase in for every 100 milliseconds of speed. So we know that in order to maintain our revenue, we have to be fast in our delivery, ensure that our experience is really customer focused. So maybe this is a driver that you can use to justify performance testing. Are you going to be missing income? On the screen we've got a stat from Trainline in the UK who sell train tickets, and they recently reported an additional $12 million of income by reducing latency by only 0.3 seconds. How do they know this? They measured it. It's really important to measure it as well. And this helps drive that conversation around justifying performance and the value of performance. So I don't think there's many any companies like Google that proudly display the time it took for their search engine results on their front page. I haven't seen anyone else do it, but it certainly need to make sure that your organization is starting to capture this, or your project's capturing, or talk to your project about capturing it, so that you're not flying blind into a storm, because we saw one of those earlier in the year, and I think it was something that we'd all like to avoid. And this brings us on to our third point around, one of the ways to ensure that we can justify performance testing is around brand reputation. The census fail, I mean, this was massive, and it's multiplied by the fact that we're seeing 29% or up to 29% of people are likely to complain on social media if they have a poor or bad experience. This is a selection of some of the tweets that came out that night, but census fail was ranking very highly on Google. There was songs. There was, it was a really exciting time for comedians because it gave them something great to talk about.
And it's not very often, Joel, that you hear comedians making jokes about performance testing. So it was a special time for performance testers as well, because we were suddenly mainstream news, which was great.
Absolutely, it brought performance into the viewpoint for all the wrong and right reasons, and I think it was quite interesting because very early on we started seeing people talk about in their tweets, what didn't they load test this? This is something we didn't see with the Maya site. So in the last couple of years we've seen that awareness of performance testing really increase. Now look, we know they did performance test it, it's all public record. We know they did security test it, but I think we're still waiting to see the full story of this. Typically what it comes down to is a piecemeal approach. We're not looking at the whole picture, we're not looking at performance end to end, we're looking at performance of an application only. So the brand reputation, now your organization may not be as high profile as something like the census, but nobody wants to be known for being slow. So I think this is another way that you can angle that justification for performance testing. As I mentioned previously, everyone is a critic. We're getting instant feedback on applications. We're getting instant feedback on social media, app store reviews. This is the graph down the bottom that shows the interest over time for census fail. It wasn't trending very well until the night, and then that's all people were searching for. So people, not only were they interested in what's happening, they were interested in reading the reviews and reading the jokes and looking into what everyone was talking about it. So we're seeing that increase significantly. So what we really want to understand is, why is this still happening? Why are we repeating ourselves? When's the last time Facebook or Twitter went down? I mean, originally Twitter was famous for their fail whale. It came up all the time. But they've since solved the problems. Are we telling me that the census sees traffic higher than Facebook or Google or Twitter? It's highly unlikely. It's just the fact that performance isn't often appreciated, and it's a bit like insurance. It's not really important until it's really important. So these are the ways that we look at to help us to justify performance. It's critical to know why the performance is important to your business. It's critical to understand what the risks associated are to achieving those objectives, and understanding what the cost of failure are. And those costs may not always be financial. They might be things that are less tangible, like the brand reputation. These are also really important to make sure that we understand these objectives early on, so we can actually design our applications and build our applications to be fast. There's no point getting to the end of a test, and this is something that we see in the industry all the time, where we go to run a test and we say, okay, look, what's your targets, what's your SLAs, your KPIs, your NFRs? What's a successful test for you? And people say, oh, I don't know, what's industry standard? Should it be 3 seconds? This is the type of information that you need to know early on, so the earlier you can identify this, the better. Which brings us on to our next section, how and when should we implement performance testing?
Yeah, and I just wanted to pick up on something from the previous slide, Joel. The other thing I think that you can understand by understanding the risks and objectives early on is whether you need performance testing. I mean, in the instances we've talked about, obviously performance testing is appropriate, but there would be instances where we're deploying, a small application with a very small audience, internal staff maybe, where the level of performance testing required might not be very significant, and the performance testing might just be, we'll see how it works. It's about understanding the risk of failure and the cost of failure. And it doesn't always mean that we have to do an awful lot of performance testing. But, in a lot of instances we do, and that's why we need to make sure we get it done properly, which is where we'll go to in the how and when section.
Yeah, absolutely. Great points, Will. And that's something we see a lot. You know, we actually see projects that have the funding doing performance testing rather than the projects that necessarily need it. And that's where that objective and risk-based approach really helps to understand and justify why this particular project needs performance. Because you're right, it may not be the big project that needs it. There may be small projects that don't need it, but there may be something in the middle that is crying out for performance testing because of the risks and cost of failure associated.
So how and when we do performance testing. So this is something that I think has certainly changed in the sort of 14 or so years I've been doing performance testing. You know, when I started out, we were doing performance testing late in the day. It kind of started when you had a system largely in place. You know, the view was that you needed something close to production in order to run a realistic performance test. You needed a full-scale environment to run on, and that view has changed over the past years. So, you know, we're starting to look at borrowing some terms from the automation world and looking at test-driven development to help define our non-functional requirements, because this is critical. This follows up from the idea of risks and objectives that we talked about on the prior slides. Those risks and objectives should become your non-functional requirements. They should form the basis to what you test to. So yes, it takes extra time up front, and test-driven development, TDD, is a kind of extreme form of that, but any time you invest time in your non-functional requirements, the benefits are enormous later on, because you get the testing right and you're able to tell if a test was successful, which is critical. So BDD for performance, business behavior-driven development. This is again borrowing automation concepts and adapting them to the performance landscape. So performance testing has kind of lagged behind automation in a lot of these concepts, and I think what we're starting to see is organizations adopting some of the concepts in order to make better NFRs. So, you know, in years gone by, a good non-functional requirement might have been considered to be, oh, the system must respond in less than 2 seconds. However, really that doesn't give you enough information, because what's a response and what's the system and what's less than 2 seconds? Does that mean it must never respond in more than 2 seconds? So by breaking it down, we can see in this example, it's a much more specific non-functional requirement. So given a web service named weather, when I call the method get current temperature with a valid postcode 1,000 times, then I expect to return containing the current temperature. Responses should take less than 2 seconds 95% of the time, and never take more than 5 seconds. And the error rate should be less than 1%. So that is a much more detailed and comprehensive non-functional requirement than anything I've seen in the real world, to be honest. And this is a great thing to move towards, because the better your requirements, the better your testing, and that means the better outcome for the project. So how do you get any value from performance testing? As we said, from NFRs, it's important to hit those NFRs early, to build them. So this is the old-fashioned view of performance testing. This is kind of what I alluded to with the engagements in my early days. You started your performance test strategy while UAT was running. So that was the first time you and probably anyone on the project had really looked at the non-functional requirements. So quite often on projects I did in the early days, you'd start out and you'd say, well, what are the non-functional requirements? And the answer would be, well, we don't know, we haven't thought about it. And at that point, you know, the system's mostly built in an older waterfall or V model environment. You know, the development is largely complete, the design's largely complete, and all of this has been done without any thought about performance testing. So the developers have built this system without really thinking about how many users it's going to support. It's been designed without knowing how many users it's going to support. And while this sort of classic view of performance testing kind of has its place, we still need to be getting involved much earlier, getting involved at the requirements, at the project inception, to work out what those risks are, to get good NFRs, and to make sure that, you know, we're building the right tests to meet the right purpose. And why do we need to get test early? Because it gets expensive to fix defects. The later we leave them, the more expensive. So if we're finding these defects in the UAT stage, they're very expensive to fix. If we can identify defects in performance in the user requirements, it's a much simpler, easier fix. Even if we can identify defects, you know, while we're still actively building this system, we can fix them much more simply without having to do real detailed root cause analysis, without having to trawl through documentation to see if we match the requirements. But this gets even more complicated when we introduce an Agile methodology, because suddenly our sort of waterfall approach to performance testing looks really quite antiquated. You know, not only now are we testing late, but everyone else is testing in sprints. They're running automated regression, and I think performance testing is still seen as something that happens at the end of a project. So you might run a number of sprints in an Agile methodology and then switch over to Waterfall in order to run the performance testing, because that's how performance testing is. It's big and it's complicated, but it doesn't need to be that way. There are ways that we can test earlier, to build our testing into the sprint, to do more regular testing, and to, you know, move away from this waterfall methodology. So my view of classic performance testing is that it's too big and it's the wrong shape. And I drew a very literal indicator of that, where I've got a kind of agile process of compiling code, configuring code, running unit tests, all these cool things that the automation people get to do, and we're sat there as this big sort of lumbering dinosaur that doesn't really fit in to that process. And we need to change that. We need to move away from that view that performance testing is something that's big and happens at the end. It doesn't need to be. So the first thing I would say when it comes to performance testing is to think small, think early, and think often. So we need to stop thinking about performance testing as something that can only happen in a full-scale performance environment. There's no reason that we can't run sort of small-scale performance tests in a development environment or in a build environment. There's no reason that we can't run these tests when we've only got a portion of the code available, and there's a few ways we can support that using service virtualization, you know, and we can run these tests often because the overhead of running the test isn't there. We're not trying to run this 100,000 concurrent user load test every day, but we can run maybe 100 concurrent users, which will find if there's any significant problems in the code, and we can run that test every single day to identify issues before they become major issues further down the line, so we can fix these issues while they're still relatively cheap to fix, and not wait until we're 2 days away from production and we find that the thing can only support 2 concurrent users. So we also need to think about mobile testing for performance. So this is something, again, that people don't really consider. So there's kind of 3 facets to mobile performance testing. One is the protocol level, where we're actually, you know, we're testing the communication between an app or a mobile website and the back end, which is great. It tells us the performance of the back end, but it doesn't really tell us the performance of the device, the performance of the application on the device. So then we can add in real or emulated devices depending on the preference. There are pros and cons to both, but we need to do some element of device testing in order to determine how the application will run on a real device, to determine what the real user experience is going to be like. And the reason for that is if we put this app on the App Store and it doesn't work, it doesn't perform, it's not satisfactory, people will complain. People will be on their App Store, whether it's Apple or Android, and complain that the app is terrible, that it doesn't load quickly, and they'll stop using it. So you lose customers, you lose revenue. And the other part of this is network virtualization. So what happens when a user goes in a tunnel, when they're on a train or their signal drops out? They've no longer got Wi-Fi connection, they've no longer got 4G, their signal drops down to GPRS. We need to think about the impact of those things, and we can test that with network virtualization to simulate those environments. And this takes us towards a view of having true holistic application performance management. So having clear goals, so we understand exactly what we want of the application so that we can build it to meet that purpose. If I'm developing an app that I plan on 50 people using it, there's no point in building it so 50,000 people can use it. And much to the same way, if I'm building an application for 50,000 people to use, there's very little value in building an app that only 50 people can use. And that allows us, when we've got clear goals, we can have targeted mitigation, so we can work on the things that are really important. So we don't sweat the small stuff. You know, we can focus on the high-risk activities, the really important stuff that we need people to get done. And we can get constant feedback. So by having performance monitoring on our production environments, we can see what real users are experiencing. So in many instances, we can find the issues before they affect our users. We can spot that someone's having bad experiences making an online payment or whatever it happens to be. And that allows us to respond. And in many instances, we can respond and adapt before anyone's got too annoyed about it. So it allows us to adapt quickly and to change our approach and to change our plans according to what we're seeing in the real world. So that's sort of the brief summary of the how and when we do performance testing now. There's obviously a lot more to it than we've covered there. Would welcome any questions or feedback either in this session or follow up by email. But where are we going tomorrow? And I'm going to hand back to Joel to figure out, you know, with the industry changing so much, what are we going to see in the performance test world in the coming years?
Fantastic, thanks, Will. Absolutely. You know, we've already seen a large number of changes even over the last 5 years that have caused some major changes to the way we manage performance and do performance testing. And I think back to that previous slide, this is something that you know, just wasn't happening 5 years ago. It was very much a tick in the box for performance. It was very much at the end of the project, as Will said. And now we're starting to see that, you know, that whole view of how do we manage our application performance, not just at the single point in time, but let's look holistically at it. And I think that's where a lot of these industry trends are taking us, in ways to better adapt to support that holistic view, and ways to more quickly implement and find out those results, so we're not, you know, waiting till the end of the train to find out that we're late. One of the things that we noticed with our Planit Index, it's something that we do every year, and this year's our 10th year, is that performance really isn't appreciated. Despite all of the discussion early on about census, about Maya and MySchool, looking at the impact to Trainline in the UK, who saw a massive increase in revenue through increasing their speed of their website and their mobile application, the performance still isn't appreciated. We're only finding that 25% of organizations and projects consider performance as a key part of their software development lifecycle, and 16% don't utilize it at all. And what we wanted to really look at is why is this still the case? And it really came down to the fact that performance isn't understood, it's often left too late, or it's considered too expensive. And we're seeing that this is some of the drivers for some of those innovations. We're also seeing a bit of a change here in terms of Agile. So we've got 2010, only 28% of projects were Agile. We're now up to 42% in 2015. And you know, when the 2016 results come out, I'm only imagining that will increase further. We're seeing that speed of delivery, you know, the continuous integration approach is rapidly changing the way we do performance. You know, how do we run a performance test in 2 days at the end of a sprint? Maybe there's ways, but the old ways didn't work, and I think, you know, this is again some of the drivers for these changes. What was interesting in last year's index is that we asked people about what are some of the industry trends that they're expecting to see over 2016. We saw a large view of automation. In fact, 26% of respondents thought that test automation was going to be an industry trend for 2016. They also saw DevOps, mobile, tools, cloud, agile, all the words you've been hearing. Performance testing came in at 1%, which is very, very disheartening in some ways, but it's exciting in others. I think it just means that as an industry we need to get more on the train. We need to get into the mobile space. We need to get better into agile integration. We need to let people understand the value of performance within a DevOps environment where we're actually doing performance testing as part of each build, as part of each you know, release. We want to make sure that we've performance tested it, even if we are releasing 1, 2, 3, 20 times in a day. So infrastructure in the cloud. This is one of the early advancements in performance testing that we've seen, and it's well catered for now. So what I mean by that is that test infrastructure, performance test infrastructure, often needs a large number of machines to simulate the large number of users that are visiting our site. If we're going to simulate 50,000 users, we need a large number of machines that are pretending to be those users against our website. It's very difficult for a project or an organization to justify purchasing 100, 200 machines that are going to be used for a one-off activity before go live. So infrastructure in the cloud has allowed us to quickly and cost-effectively fire up infrastructure anywhere in the world, use it for when we need it, and throw it away afterwards. And we've been utilizing this for the last 5 years with great success, and we've seen it becoming almost the default for most of our projects, where people are asking us to come and bring the infrastructure with us within our tests, and we're seeing that just generally across the industry. But not only is it infrastructure in the cloud from a test point of view, we also have our environments moving to the cloud. And this is allowing us to get around some of the issues that we see around, that we've seen previously, where we do not have an adequate test environment. Previously we were very, very constrained. We may have a test environment which is scaled down from production, but even harder, it's not scaled down evenly from production. It may be 75% of the web servers, it might be 25% of the app servers, but it might be 300% of the database, because that database server is being shared amongst 3 or 4 other test environments. So it's been very difficult, and I'll chat about this later. We've actually had a question come through about how we deal with that. It's been very difficult in the past to validate our performance tests and mirror them with production. So what we're seeing now is as people move their infrastructure to the cloud, it's being a lot easier for us to fire up a whole new test environment in the cloud, because it's just a click of a button and that gets deployed. We're also seeing that by doing that, there's a number of complications along the way. So there's issues such as scaling load balancers. There's issues such as DNSs that you know, that are dynamic. There's issues of auto scaling and scaling up, scaling down. All of these are fantastic features of the cloud and really help benefit your delivery of your applications, but they do bring in a significant area of complexity that needs to be tested. There's no point putting auto-scaling on if you haven't tested that it does scale as you require it. And how quickly a user is going to be on the site depends on how well your scaling strategy works. We're also seeing a move to serverless infrastructure with things like AWS Lambda. These are all challenges for performance and challenges for how we ensure that your customer experience is going to be very, very high. So this is an area where, as performance testers, as project managers, as product owners, as CTOs, we all need to be thinking about how's the performance of the cloud going to impact our applications. Another trend we're seeing, and it's very much along the same lines, is the use of service virtualization. Yes, we can fire up a small environment in the cloud, we can replicate things, but we maybe have integrations with third-party applications like a payment gateway or a legacy application or a third-party service that's being provided around customer data or loyalty that we can't actually performance test. If they're offering in a software as a service, they often won't let you performance test it. And this is where we're using service virtualization to stub out the components that we don't have control of, so we can create small, tight, concise test environments to run performance testing on. And that's allowing us to do things a lot more quickly and be able to integrate those tests into that continuous integration environment. Performance big data is another one. Will, would you like to chat about big data? I don't want to hog the spotlight here.
Yeah, so I guess what we've got here is the performance is now finally part of the Agile life cycle. So I think if you click the slide again, we can now start doing some more interesting things with the data. So if we're running a test every single day, I'm sure most of the people who have done some performance testing online where the performance testing generates an awful lot of data. And what I find to be very important is turning that data into meaningful information. And it's easy enough for one person to do when you're running one test a week, but when you're running a test every single day, we need to come up with clever ways of mapping it, of looking for trends, of predicting the performance, of predicting what's going to happen with an application, and understanding how it changes over time. So what impact did the latest build have? What impact did the same build in another environment have? And being able to track that, dashboard it, so that we're doing clever things with the data, so that we're getting useful information out of that data.
Continuous performance. This is the dream, isn't it, Will? This is the dream. This is an area where, this is a major industry trend that we're seeing. And it's something that, we're all striving to get to. And we're actually seeing some organizations who are doing it really well and some organizations who are, starting their journey and trying to integrate it into it. We actually found with a lot of discussions around performance that I think Will made a great point before, that performance is often lagging behind, the maturity of something like automation, and we're definitely seeing that with performance into the continuous delivery lifecycle. There's a couple of features here or enablers for this is around the virtualization for early tests. It's around maybe it's not even performance testing. Maybe in Sprint we're doing things like performance profiling of our page using tools like YSlow, using things like Lighthouse from Google. Looking at the page load time and looking at that in the Sprint, and then having a smaller test build that's deployed. We deploy an environment with stubbed out third-party services with specific data usage that we can run on every single build and say, hey, look, it's degraded from an application point of view. Running smaller tests at an integration level, looking at services, looking at our whole application and where we can run those performance tests to ensure that we're getting that continuous metrics, especially as those builds increase. And I think this is where trending really comes in. We'll notice with trends that if we're running a build every single day, let's say it's a daily build, and we've got an SLA of 3 seconds for a page, it might start off at 2. We may only get an alert when it hits 3 seconds and say, oh, you've broken something in the build. Now, it may not actually be anything to do with that build. It may be that every release for the last month has been slowly increasing our response times. And this is where there's a lot of considerations around performance to take into account for continuous to get to continuous performance, and I think it's a really exciting area for us over the next sort of year or so. So just to summarize, before we answer a few of the questions that we've come through, to justifying the investment into performance testing, we really need to understand why performance testing is important and why it's in your organization, and that's the key to gaining traction and implementing performance best test practice. So understanding what are the pain points for your organization, what are the risks that we're worried about, what are the costs of failures, and knowing that with things like social media, a failure of our website or a slow website is going to quickly be reported, and it's quickly going to be talked about. Your App Store reviews are going to be dropping down to 1 star very, very quickly.
And the how, the why, and the when. So the important part is to start early, to test at the requirement level, so to understand the objectives, the risks, to understand the NFRs, to get good NFRs, and then to start testing as early as we can and to use the technology that's available. So use virtualization, use infrastructure in the cloud in order to be able to run more tests, use sort of the big data analytics in order to be able to get more information out of your smaller scale tests that you're running more frequently.
We'll just get to some of the questions that we've got so far. So the first one is from Luke, and I'll ask this to you, Will. How do you eliminate the environment factors in terms of the difference between dev, test, UAT, and production in a performance test?
So I think for me the simplest way of doing that is by comparison. So rather than thinking about, when you're thinking about a smaller scale performance test, rather than thinking about it as a hardware test, think about it as a code test. So it's about baselining and comparing. So if we're running a performance test every day in a build environment, then yes, we're not going to be able to use those results to say whether or not the application will work in production, but we'll be able to identify issues in the code and issues introduced to the code. So that nothing's going to replace running that big scale performance test in a production-like environment, but what we can do is we can move the risk to the left. We can shift left, as they like to say these days, and find out whether we're going to get performance issues earlier by testing in a smaller scale environment.
Fantastic, thanks Will. We've got another great question here that talks about the fact that our performance tools being used in the market these days are changing quite a bit. We're seeing people move away from the traditional tools such as LoadRunner and starting to go into a lot more of the open source tools such as JMeter. We've got all of the online sites such as BlazeMeter and Flood. What do we think about this change? Look, personally, I'm all for it. I think that any increase in the ability to do performance testing for environments where we may not have had the budget previously to support some of the the commercial tools is great. I still think the commercial tools are very good and they have a place and we use them quite often. But I am very excited to see that people are really getting excited about performance and understanding that we don't necessarily need, for some applications, a huge commercial tool to get that going. Now look, it's actually interesting that we're seeing this shift now at the same time that we're seeing our applications, our web applications, becoming more complex. So what we're actually seeing now is heavier front-end applications that are using more JavaScript, we're using more asynchronous code, and we're actually seeing that a lot of the open source tools are very good at simulating the HTTP requests, but not necessarily the browser approach. And I think that's probably where we're going to see the change over the next couple of years with those open source tools. So things like web services, they're very good at, but some of the more complex web applications, they're a little bit behind some of the commercial tools in that space. Although we are seeing some great things around using Selenium scripts in a grid to do that. Here's one for you, Will. Can performance testing tools be integrated into a CI environment?
Absolutely. I think we hit on that a little bit during the presentation. I think you absolutely can. I think the tools aren't the limitation there. It's more to do with how you apply the tool. There's no reason, as far as I'm aware, all the major performance test tools can be triggered from the command line, and if you can trigger something from the command line, you can integrate it into a build server CI environment. It's just a question of what you try and run. So if you've got a 10,000 user load test in LoadRunner that you try and run every day, it's going to cause issues. That's not going to be something you can integrate with your CI environment. If you, however, come up with a smaller scale performance test, that is something you can run every day and run in your CI environment.
Perfect. Thanks, Will. We've got another question here about what are some of the performance metrics other than speed that are important? And I think this is a great one, and I guess joins on to some of the stuff that we've already talked about today, which is around the fact that, you know, page load times isn't necessarily what we're worried about anymore. In fact, what we're starting to look at is that time to interaction, time to first interaction is really important. So it's not just about how quickly does all my assets load. We've got a lot smarter than that with things like React.js and these dynamic designs. So we're actually starting to look at, you know, things like when's the application first being painted? When's our first content, first meaningful content being painted on the screen? When is it visually ready? When is it actually ready to engage? Because the actual page being fully loaded doesn't matter to most people as long as they feel, as long as the perception is that they can interact with the page and start using it, and not waiting for certain things to come in, or waiting for images to load and the page starts jagging around while images load. I've noticed that on news sites all the time. You start to read it and all of a sudden, bang, it throws you off because it's loaded a large image above. So I think there's a lot more to it necessarily than just speed. It's about that customer perception. So you can have a page that takes 6 seconds to load as long as it's interactive and usable within a short amount of time. And I think Amazon's a great example of this. The Amazon website, if you look at it with some of the browser tools, it's downloading for minutes after you finish the page load because it's trying to prepare for what you're going to do next and preloading a lot of that information. All right, look, we've got a few more questions, and we'll be able to answer some of those in an email that we send out afterwards. So we'll wrap it up there. Thanks very much to everyone for attending. It's really exciting for us, myself and Will, to talk about performance. We love it, and as Will said before, any emails will be followed up and answered with questions. So thanks very much from me. Will?
Yeah, thanks very much. Thanks for listening, guys. Appreciate you taking the time out. And yeah, any questions, please get in touch. Joel and I are on LinkedIn and all the rest of it, so please feel free to get in touch with us and ask any questions you have.
And keep an eye out for the index, which is coming up in November. So that's a great event, and talks about some of the trends, not just in performance but across the whole testing industry. That would be it's really valuable. But thanks very much. Appreciate your time, and talk to you next time.